Millionaire falls in love with homeless young woman, and it becomes the scandal of the year. She was living on the sidewalks with her children when he spotted her through a restaurant window. While everyone criticized their relationship, he made decisions that would change her life forever. But not everything was acceptance. The elite rejected her, and her past hides something that could shake everything. If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. We continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear in your life. Breakfast was getting cold on the plate when Richard finally looked up from the newspaper. The corner table, his favorite for 3 years, offered the perfect view of the morning. Hustle without exposing him too much to curious glances. At 42, he had learned to value discretion as much as the money he had accumulated over decades of building a silent and efficient real estate empire. She entered like a controlled gust of wind. Megan carried a brown leather folder and a posture that betrayed years of tense meetings and difficult decisions. Her brown hair was tied in a bun that resisted her hurried movement, and when her eyes met Richard's, there was an instant and mutual recognition. "Mr. Sanders?" Her voice had a firmness that contrasted with the subtlety of her gestures. "Megan Albright from the Public Defender's Office. Thank you for accepting this meeting." Richard nodded toward the chair in front of him, observing how she settled in with calculated precision. Everything about her seemed measured, from the way she placed her folder beside the chair to the way she folded her hands on the table. She was the type of woman he instinctively respected, those who fought tooth and nail for causes greater than themselves. "I must admit your call intrigued me," Richard confessed, signaling for the waiter to bring another coffee. "Social projects don't usually appear on the agenda of businessmen like me." Megan smiled for the first time since she'd arrived, but there was something melancholic about that smile. "Perhaps that's exactly why I need your help. Sometimes those who are outside the system can see solutions that we immersed in it can no longer see." She opened her folder and pulled out a series of documents organized with military precision. Richard noticed her hands. They were delicate, but there were small scars between the fingers, as if she had grown up dealing with adversities that didn't match her refined education. "What I'm going to show you isn't official," Megan began, her voice dropping a few tones. "But I believe you're someone who understands the difference between what's legal and what's just." Outside the cafe, pressed against the window, fogged by the morning condensation, a thin face observed the internal scene with a mixture of hope and despair. Julie was 23, but seemed to carry the weight of an entire lifetime on her curved back and in her sunken eyes. Her blonde hair, which must have once been golden and bright, now hung lifelessly around a face that hunger had made even more angular. She couldn't take her eyes off the table where two seemingly important people were discussing matters that certainly didn't include her. She hadn't eaten a complete meal in 3 days. 2 weeks ago, she had lost her job at a used clothing store because she was late for the 3rd time. The bus she could afford didn't always run on schedule. 6 months ago, she had left the home of a family that had temporarily taken her in, but could no longer support an extra mouth. The aroma of fresh bread and coffee that escaped each time someone entered or left the cafe was a sweet torture. Julie pressed her palm against her stomach, trying to calm the noises that betrayed her situation. It wasn't pride that prevented her from asking for help. She had lost that luxury long ago. It was fear. Fear of being rejected once more. Fear of being seen as a problem. Fear of discovering that there really was no place for her anywhere. Inside the cafe, Megan was spreading photographs across the table. They were images of children and young people, some in black and white, others in color but faded by time. Richard picked up one of them, a girl of no more than 10, smiling with uneven teeth in what was clearly an institutional photograph. "St. Gabriel's Shelter," Megan explained, noticing his interest in that specific photo. It operated for 15 years in the northern part of the city. Officially, it was closed due to administrative irregularities. Unofficially, she hesitated, as if the next words were physically painful to pronounce. Unofficially, many children simply disappeared from the records in the final years of operation. Richard frowned. Disappeared how? Runaways? Adoptions? That's the question. There are no consistent records, some left at 18 as is natural. Others, well, it's as if they never existed. The files are incomplete, contradictory, and whenever someone tried to investigate further, they hit closed doors. Megan's folder seemed like a secret archive. There were newspaper clippings, copies of official documents, photographs, and even children's drawings. It was the work of years of silent investigation, the kind of obsession that consumes a person from within. Richard took a sip of coffee, which was now bitter and cold. Why me? Why not the police, the district attorney, the press? Megan laughed, but there was no joy in that sound. Because I've tried all those avenues. The police say there's no crime without a body. The DA cites lack of evidence. The press, well, the press prefers stories with clear villains and happy endings. This is too grey, too complicated. She leaned forward, and Richard could see that her eyes were slightly moist. I need someone with enough resources and influence to ask the right questions in the right places, someone who doesn't depend on the system to survive. It was at that moment that Megan looked outside, and her eyes fixed on the face pressed against the glass. Julie didn't realize she was being observed. She was hypnotized by the normality of that internal scene, by the possibility of belonging to a world where people sat at clean tables and talked about problems that didn't include where to sleep that night. But Megan saw something that made her heart race. There was something familiar about that face, that posture, those eyes that she recognized from somewhere very specific and very painful in her past. Unable to control the impulse, she rose abruptly. "Excuse me," she said to Richard, who watched her walk toward the door with a sudden determination that didn't match the controlled tone of the previous conversation. Julie tried to move away when she realized the elegant woman was approaching, but Megan was quicker. "Wait," she said, her voice now completely different, softer, almost maternal. "Are you hungry?" The question was obvious, but Julie couldn't answer. She just looked at Megan with a mixture of gratitude and distrust that broke the defender's heart. It was a look she knew well, one she had seen on dozens of other faces over the years. But there was something more in those eyes, something that made her feel as if she were looking at a ghost. "Come," Megan said, extending her hand. "Let's talk." Julie hesitated at the threshold, like a wounded animal that can't distinguish between a trap and an opportunity for healing. Megan waited patiently, keeping her hand extended without forcing the approach. There was something in the delicacy of that gesture that disarmed the defenses Julie had built over the years. "I'm not a beggar," Julie murmured, but her voice lacked the conviction necessary to make the statement convincing. "I know," Megan replied simply, "but we all need help sometimes, even those who offer help." Richard observed the scene from his place at the table, intrigued by the sudden change in Megan's behavior. The woman who minutes before had been discussing legal strategies with professional coolness now demonstrated a vulnerability that seemed to come from much deeper than simple humanitarian compassion. Julie finally crossed the doorway, walking as if she were stepping on sacred ground. Her clothes were clean, but worn from excessive use and the absence of alternatives. There was a dignity in her posture that resisted adverse circumstances. It was the kind of strength that only develops when one is forced to face the world alone from a very young age. Megan led her to a table near Richard's, but not exactly the same one. There was a subtle wisdom in this choice, close enough to include her in the conversation, but distant enough to preserve her autonomy. As Julie settled in, Megan made a discreet sign to the waiter. "One complete daily special," she ordered, without consulting Julie, "and a fresh orange juice." The waiter nodded and walked away, leaving the two women in silence. Julie stared fixedly at her intertwined hands on the table, as if afraid that raising her eyes would break the spell of this unexpected moment of kindness. "What's your name?" Megan asked, keeping the soft tone she had used in her approach. "Julie." The answer came low, almost a whisper. Megan felt as if the world had stopped for an instant. Julie. The name echoed in her mind with the force of a revelation. It couldn't be a coincidence. It couldn't be just the physical resemblance that had caught her attention. There was something in the way she had pronounced her own name, a subtle hesitation, as if she wasn't sure it still belonged to her. "Julie," Megan repeated, testing the sound. It's a beautiful name. While they waited for the order to arrive, Megan fought against the urge to ask the questions burning in her throat. How old are you? Where did you come from? Have you ever lived in a place called St. Gabriel's Shelter? But she knew that rushing could destroy any chance of discovering the truth. Richard, at the adjacent table, tried to focus on the documents Megan had left scattered, but his eyes constantly strayed to the young woman who was now eating with contained voracity. There was something in the whole scene that bothered him, not Megan's compassion, which he admired, but the intensity of her reaction. It was as if she had recognized someone, not just identified a person in need. Across the street, watching through the window of a clothing store, Helen Vaughan felt the blood freeze in her veins. At 51, she had learned to control her emotions with the precision of a surgeon, but what she saw through that window threatened to topple years of carefully constructed self-control. The girl, that girl who was now eating voraciously at a table in the cafe, was impossible to forget, even after so many years. Helen had spent the last decade trying to erase that face from her memory, but there it was again, thinner, more adult, but unmistakably the same. Helen had been the administrative director of St. Gabriel's Shelter during its last 5 years of operation. Officially, she had left the position for personal reasons. In reality, she had fled from a situation that had become unsustainable, taking with her secrets that could destroy not only her career, but her entire comfortable existence built afterward. Julie. She remembered the name now with painful clarity, one of the last children to leave the institution before its definitive closure, but she hadn't left in the official way, through the proper channels. She had disappeared on a stormy night at 17, leaving only a scribbled note that Helen had immediately destroyed. What terrified her most wasn't Julie's reappearance, but who was sitting at the table with her. Helen recognized Megan Albright from photographs in local newspapers, the public defender who had become a kind of silent heroine of lost causes. If Julie and Megan were together, it wasn't coincidence. Helen stepped away from the window, her legs trembling slightly. She needed to think, needed to decide what to do. She could simply walk away, pretend she had never seen that scene. She could return to her comfortable life, to her elegant apartment, to her discreet job at a private foundation that did good without asking complicated questions. But she knew she couldn't. Julie had been more than just another of the children under her responsibility. She had been the only one who had the courage to ask the questions nobody wanted to hear, who had discovered things that should have remained buried. Back at the Zoo Cafe, Julie had finished eating and was now looking directly at Megan for the first time since she had sat down. "Why did you do this?" she asked, her voice now firmer. Megan smiled, but there was a deep melancholy in that smile. "Because I recognize someone who has been through much more than they should have." "You don't know me?" "Perhaps not completely," Megan admitted, "but I know that look. I've seen it in many people who have been through difficult situations." Julie tilted her head, studying Megan's face with new attention. "You work with this? With people like me?" "I work with justice," Megan answered carefully. "Or at least I try to work with justice in a world that doesn't always facilitate it." It was then that Julie noticed the documents spread on the table, next door, where the elegant man continued pretending to read the newspaper while obviously listening to the conversation. There were photographs among the papers, and even from a distance, she could see they were young faces. "What is that?" she asked, discreetly pointing to Richard's table. Megan exchanged a significant look with Richard, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "It's a case I'm investigating," Megan said slowly, "about an institution that cared for children and young people. An institution that was closed a few years ago for irregularities." Julie's face visibly paled. Her hands, which had been relaxed on the table, closed into involuntary fists. "What kind of irregularities?" Her voice was barely a thread. Megan hesitated. She knew she was walking a very thin line. "Children who disappeared from official records. Young people who simply vanished from the system." Julie rose abruptly, knocking over the chair in the process. Her face had lost all color, and her hands were visibly trembling. "I need to go," she said, her voice breaking. But before she could take a step, Richard stood up and, in a gesture that surprised everyone, including himself, dropped an old notebook on the floor, right at Julie's feet. "Sorry," he said, bending down to pick it up. "How clumsy of me." Julie, by instinct, also bent down to help. Her hands touched the notebook at the same time as Richard's, and when she looked down, she saw her own name, written in a list of handwritten names on the open page. The world stopped. The silence that followed was so dense, it seemed to absorb all other sounds in the cafe. Julie stared at her own name on the yellowed page of the notebook, as if she was seeing a ghost materializing before her eyes. Her breathing became irregular, and Megan instinctively reached out to support her. "How do you have this?" Julie whispered, her words barely leaving her throat. Richard looked at Megan, seeking silent approval. When she nodded almost imperceptibly, he sat down on the floor itself, right in the middle of the cafe, putting himself on the same level as Julie. "My name is Richard Sanders," he said softly. "And 10 years ago, I tried to save you, and 16 other children from that institution." Julie instinctively backed away, but her back hit the overturned chair. She was cornered between the present and a past she had desperately tried to bury. "That's not possible," she murmured. "Nobody tried to save us. Nobody cared." Richard opened the notebook to a specific page. There were detailed notes, dates, times, and next to Julie's name, an observation in red ink. "Transfer cancelled. External threat confirmed." "I cared," Richard said, his voice laden with guilt he had carried for a decade. "I had a project, resources, a legal team. We were going to get all of you out of there and create a real, efficient, humane support system. But," he hesitated, looking at his own hands as if they contained the answer to years of regret. "But they threatened your family," Megan completed, her voice soft but firm. "They threatened your company, your reputation, and you backed down." Richard nodded, unable to find words to justify his past cowardice. "I received a call, a voice that knew details about my personal life, about my business, about people I loved. They said if I continued investigating, it wouldn't be just my life that would be destroyed." Julie slowly stood up, leaning on the table. Her mind was working frantically, connecting fragments of memories she had spent years trying to forget. "There were rumors," she said, her voice gradually gaining strength. "The older girls talked about someone who was asking questions, who was trying to help us. But then suddenly everything stopped. The staff became more nervous, more aggressive, and they started making lists." Megan felt a shiver run down her spine. "What kind of lists?" "Of who was causing problems. Of who asked too many questions. Of who—" Julie paused, looking directly at Richard. "Of who was most likely to tell the truth if someone asked." Richard closed his eyes, the guilt weighing on his shoulders like a stone. "Your name was at the top of my priority list. You were the oldest, the most articulate. I knew that if I could get you out of there, you could help the others." "But you couldn't," Julie said with no accusation in her voice, just a painful observation, "and I had to save myself." It was then that Helen finally gathered the courage to enter the café. Her steps were calculated, her breathing controlled, but inside her heart was beating like a war drum. She had spent the last 15 minutes outside, fighting against the voice of conscience that pushed her inside, and the survival instinct that told her to run. Megan was the first to notice her, an elegant woman in her 50s with perfectly groomed hair and expensive clothes, but with a tension in her shoulders that betrayed a deep internal conflict. She approached the table with the determination of someone who had made an irreversible decision. "Julie Mendez," Helen said, her voice surprisingly firm. "You've grown." All eyes turned to the newcomer. Julie observed her with a mixture of confusion and gradual recognition. There was something familiar about that face, that posture, that specific way of pronouncing her name. "Do I know you?" Julie asked, but her voice betrayed that she already suspected the answer. Helen pulled a chair from the empty table next door and sat down without being invited. "Helen Vaughan. I was the administrative director of St. Gabriel's Shelter." The air in the cafe seemed to get heavier. Richard instinctively positioned himself slightly in front of Julie, as if he could retroactively protect her. Megan leaned forward, all her public defender instincts on high alert. "You," Julie said, her voice now laden with anger that had fermented for years. "You knew. You knew everything and did nothing." Helen didn't deny it. She didn't try to justify herself. She simply nodded slowly. "I knew," she admitted, "and you're right. I did nothing to stop it, but—" She hesitated, looking directly into Julie's eyes. "I saved your records." She opened her purse and took out a brown leather folder similar to the one Megan had brought, but visibly older and more worn. When the institution was closed, all the files should have been destroyed. The order came from very high up, from people with enough power to make documents simply disappear, but I couldn't do it. Helen opened the folder, revealing dozens of individual files, photographs, medical and psychological reports. 17 children officially disappeared from the system, she continued, but they didn't really disappear. They were transferred to other institutions, some out of state. Others, like you, simply ran away before that could happen. Richard took the folder from Helen's hands with an almost desperate urgency. His hands trembled slightly as he leafed through the documents. "Why did you keep this?" Megan asked, her professional voice masking the emotional storm she felt inside. "Guilt," Helen answered simply, "and fear. And perhaps deep down, the hope that one day I would have the courage to do the right thing." Julie sat heavily in the chair, as if her legs could no longer support the weight of all these revelations. "The other girls," she said, her voice breaking. "Carla, Patricia, Anna, what happened to them?" Helen turned a few pages of the folder until she found a handwritten list. "Carla was transferred to an institution in Georgia. We lost contact after that. Patricia got a foster family in North Carolina, but I'm not sure if it worked out. Anna—" She paused, taking a deep breath. "Anna ran away 2 weeks after you. We never heard from her again." The silence that followed was broken by an unexpected sound. Julie was crying. It wasn't hysterical or desperate crying, but silent tears that ran down her face as if they had been dammed up for years. "I abandoned them," she whispered. "I ran away and left them there." Megan stood up and knelt beside Julie's chair, gently, placing her hand on her shoulder. "You were a child," she said firmly. "You did what you could to survive. It wasn't your responsibility to save the others." Richard closed Helen's folder and placed it on the table with reverential care. "Now, it's our responsibility," he said, looking first at Megan, then at Helen. "We have the documents, we have the names, we have the evidence. We can find these girls. We can find out what really happened." Helen nodded slowly. "There's more," she said. "Much more. Names of influential people who knew what was happening. Money transfers, fake contracts. I documented everything I could before I fled." Julie wiped the tears from her face with the back of her hand and looked at the 3 adults around her. "Why now?" she asked. "Why are you doing this now, after so long?" It was Megan who answered, her voice laden with raw and honest emotion. "Because finding you today wasn't a coincidence. I've been looking for survivors of that institution for 2 years. You're the first I've been able to locate." Julie stared at her with new intensity. "You've been looking for me?" Megan nodded. "Through hospital records, employment files, any bureaucratic trail a person leaves when trying to rebuild their life. I knew if I could find one of you, I could find the others." "And why is this important to you?" Julie insisted. Megan hesitated, looking at Richard as if seeking encouragement. When he nodded slightly, she took a deep breath. "Because my younger sister disappeared from a similar institution 15 years ago," she said, her voice breaking slightly, "and I never found out what happened to her." Megan's revelation echoed in the cafe like distant thunder. Julie observed the defender's face with new understanding, recognizing in those eyes the same pain she herself had carried for so many years, the pain of someone who lost someone important in the bureaucratic labyrinth of a system that should protect, but that frequently failed in devastating ways. "What was her name?" Julie asked softly. "Bethany," Megan answered, her voice little more than a whisper. "Bethany Albright. She was 12 when she was taken to St. Rita's home. I was 19 and in college. Our parents had died in an accident, and I was fighting in court for her custody, but the process was taking time. They said it was temporary, that in a few months she would be back with me. Richard leaned forward, instinctively understanding the magnitude of that confession. But she never came back. Megan shook her head. 6 months later, when I finally got legal custody, they told me she had run away. There were no records of where she had gone, no real investigation, nothing, as if she had simply evaporated. Helen nervously leafed through her folder, as if looking for something specific. Her hands stopped at a separate section, with documents of a different appearance. "How old would your sister be now?" Helen asked, her voice carefully controlled. 27, Megan answered, immediately. It was obvious she counted the years with painful precision. Helen removed a photograph from the folder and placed it on the table. It was the image of a girl of approximately 13, with brown hair and eyes that had the same intensity as Megan's. "This photo was taken at St. Gabriel's Shelter," Helen said cautiously. "One of the girls arrived transferred from another institution in the last year of operation. The name in the records was Bethany Smith, but..." She hesitated, looking directly at Megan. "But she always insisted her real name was Bethany Albright." Tutats. World stopped for Megan. She picked up the photograph with trembling hands, studying every detail of the young face. Tears began to run down her face before she was even aware she was crying. "It's her," she whispered. "My God, it's her." Julie looked at the photograph over Megan's shoulder. A sudden recognition lit up her eyes. "Beth," she said suddenly. "We all called her Beth. She arrived a few months before I ran away. She was special. She took care of the younger girls as if they were her sisters." Megan grabbed Julie's arm with desperate urgency. "Where is she? What happened to her?" Julie closed her eyes, forcing her memory to retrieve details she had tried to forget. "She was on the list," she said slowly, "on the transfer list that the staff was preparing." But what?" Richard gently insisted. "But she was planning to run away too," Julie continued. "The night before my escape, she told me she had a plan, that she knew people who could help her find her older sister. She always talked about this sister who was studying to be a lawyer." Megan sobbed loudly, covering her mouth with her hands. "She was trying to find me. All this time she was trying to come home." Helen opened another section of the folder, revealing a series of handwritten documents. "Bethany ran away 3 days after you, Julie. But unlike you, she left a letter. Not for the staff, but for me. She hid it in my desk, knowing I would find it." With careful hands, Helen removed a yellowed envelope and handed it to Megan. "I kept it all these years, hoping one day to be able to deliver it to the right person." Megan opened the envelope with reverence, as if holding something sacred. The handwriting was childish, but determined. "To whoever finds this letter, my name is Bethany Albright, and I have a sister named Megan. She is studying to be a lawyer and will look for me. If something happens to me, please tell her that I never stopped trying to come home. Tell her I remember everything she taught me about being strong and helping people. If she is reading this, it means someone good found the letter. Megan, if you are reading this, I love you and I'm trying to come back to you." The silence that followed was charged with such intense emotion that it seemed tangible. Megan held the letter against her chest, crying silently for a sister she had spent 15 years searching for. "We need to find her," Richard said, his voice firm and determined. "Now that we have the documents, the records, we can track her. We can find out what happened after she ran away." Helen nodded vigorously. "I have contacts in various institutions. People who, like me, keep unofficial records. We can begin a systematic search." Julie slowly got up, walking to the cafe window. The movement outside seemed surreal after everything that had happened in the last few hours. Normal people living, normal lives, unaware of the fact that in there, in a small cafe, entire lives were being reconstructed. "I want to help," she said, turning to the others. "Not just with the search for Bethany, but with everything. With all the other girls, with the investigation, with justice." Megan looked at her with admiration and gratitude. "Are you sure? It will mean reliving many painful memories." Julie nodded firmly. "These memories never stopped existing. They were just pushed into a dark corner of my mind. Maybe it's time to bring them into the light." Richard stood up and extended his hand to Julie. "Then we're partners in this. I have the resources. Megan has the legal expertise, Helen has the documents, and you have the memories and the courage. Together we can do what should have been done a long time ago." Helen looked at the three, an expression of relief and determination taking over her face. "There's one thing you need to know," she said. "St. Gabriel's shelter wasn't an isolated case. It was part of a larger network, a system that still exists, just with other names, other places." Megan straightened up, her professional instincts taking control. "How many institutions?" "At least 8 that I know of," Helen responded, "spread across 3 states, all operating in a similar way, all with the same irregularities, all protected by the same influential people." Richard walked to the window, observing the movement on the street. "So we're not just looking for Bethany and the other girls, we're dismantling an entire system." "Exactly," Helen confirmed, "and that's going to make a lot of powerful people very unhappy." Julie returned to the table and placed her hand on the pile of documents. "Let them be unhappy. How many children are still suffering while we talk here? How many Bethanys are trying to come home? How many Julies are running away in the middle of the night?" Megan held Julie's hand, creating a physical connection with the symbolism of the moment. "Let's start today. Let's make the difference that should have been made 15 years ago." Richard joined his hand to the 2 women's. "Together." Helen hesitated for a moment, looking at the 3 hands united over the documents she had kept for so long, then decided she placed her hand on top of the others. "Together," she repeated. 3 months later, on a sunny morning of an ordinary Saturday, Julie opened the door of a small apartment she now called home. She had secured a job at an NGO that worked with children and adolescents' rights, a job that Megan had helped her get, and that Richard had financially supported during the transition period. The doorbell rang, and when she opened the door, she found Megan standing in the hallway with a radiant smile on her face and a young woman by her side. The young woman had slightly curly brown hair and eyes that shone with the same intensity as Megan's. "Julie," Megan said, her voice choked with emotion, "I want to introduce my sister, Bethany." Julie looked at the young woman and instantly recognized the features of the girl she had known so many years ago. Bethany had grown, had become a beautiful and strong woman, but there was still something familiar in her smile, the same kindness she showed when taking care of the younger girls. "Beth," Julie whispered, opening her arms. Bethany hugged her tightly, and during that moment all the pains of the past seemed to transform into hope for the future. They had survived. They had found their families. They had found each other again. "We have a lot to talk about," Bethany said, smiling through tears, "and a lot of work ahead." Julie nodded, knowing she was referring not only to the emotional reunion, but to the project they were all building. Together, a new support system for vulnerable children based on transparency, dignity, and true love. Richard appeared in the hallway a few minutes later, carrying a folder with new documents and a satisfied smile on his face. "We just got official approval," he announced. "The New Beginnings Foundation is officially registered and operational." Megan, Julie, and Bethany looked at each other with tears in their eyes. What had begun as a casual encounter in a cafe had transformed into a life mission for all of them. Helen arrived last, carrying a box full of meticulously organized files. "The last documents," she said. "Now we have complete records of all 17 girls from St. Gabriel's shelter, and more importantly," she smiled, "I just received a call. We found Anna." Julie's apartment filled with exclamations of joy and relief. Another family being reunited, another life being rebuilt. As the group planned the next phase of their search, Julie looked out the window and saw children playing in the playground in front of the building. They were cared for by loving parents, protected by a system that worked, surrounded by the security that every child deserved to have. She smiled, knowing that the work they were doing would ensure that more children would have the chance to grow up like that, loved, protected, free to simply be children. The meeting in that cafe had changed 4 lives forever, but more importantly, it had initiated a chain of changes that would transform hundreds of other lives in the years to come, because sometimes justice doesn't come from large institutions or governmental decisions. Sometimes it is born from 4 people sitting at a cafe table, deciding they can no longer live with the errors of the past and that they are willing to dedicate their lives to building a better future. And so, on an ordinary afternoon, in an ordinary city in America, 4 brave individuals would decide that never again would a child be forgotten, never again would a family be unnecessarily separated, and never again would the system fail to protect those who most needed protection. Justice sometimes takes time, but when it arrives, it transforms everything. The end. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Megan, Julie, Richard, and Helen has touched you deeply. This narrative about reunions, redemption, and the relentless pursuit of justice shows how 4 lives intertwined in an extraordinary way to create something greater than themselves. To continue following emotional stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell. Leave a like if this story managed to awaken in you the same hope it awakened in our protagonists. Every day we bring narratives that explore the strength of the human spirit and the capacity for transformation that we all carry within us. Share in the comments how this story made you feel. Your words are the fuel that motivates us to continue telling these stories of hope,